The restaurant was the kind of place that pretended intimacy with low lamps and dark wood, the kind of place where secrets believed they could breathe because everything smelled faintly of butter and lemon. I sat at a corner table with my hands resting perfectly on either side of a linen napkin, watching the stem of a water glass catch and release slivers of light, and I told myself I was not afraid. I counted the slow seconds by the rhythm of a ceiling fan that didn't move any air, inhaled the cold on the rim of the glass, and kept my spine straight as if posture alone could hold back a tide I had been ignoring for weeks. It was not my mother across from me. It was hers. She wore approval like a garment tailored years ago, crisp and precise, even as her eyes drifted over my shoulder the way a person watches a door they wish would open to a different room. I felt like part of the decor she had not ordered, a vase placed slightly off-center, an imperfection tolerated only because it would have made a scene to remove it. I had arrived minutes early on purpose and sat with my thumb pressed to the fine groove in the table where years of plates had left a soft trench, grounding myself in the history of where. When she took her seat, her bag made a small sound against the leather, and the tiny clink of metal inside sounded like a clock. I made a study of the luster on her nails to avoid the shape of her mouth when she looked at me. I had thought I knew what this lunch would be. I had rehearsed kindness, patience, the careful language of reassurance, the small buffer of humor I carry for rooms like this. But the twist came dressed as generosity and set itself between us like a centerpiece, a proposition disguised as concern, a carefully folded set of futures she claimed would fit me better if I were willing to cut the person I loved out of the pattern. She made space in her sentences for my supposed relief, as if I had been waiting in a locked room for permission to leave. I imagined the word no like a small, calm object I could set in the middle of the table and walk around without touching. Instead, I felt heat rise in that quiet place under the breastbone where resolve lives, and I kept both palms flat as if pinning a drawing to a drafting board. The room had the hush of afternoons when people congratulate themselves for restraint. Silverware tapped, ice shifted in glasses, someone at the bar laughed too brightly and then stopped as if spilling. I lifted my water and tasted the way cold numbs sweetness before it gives it back. I thought of her daughter's hand finding mine on a late walk, the soft pressure that said I'm here without inviting witnesses. I thought of the first time I learned the exact slope of her smile when she was trying not to say something that mattered more than both of us. I let those memories arrange themselves like an invisible place setting, fork of patience, knife of truth, spoon of tenderness. I decided I would eat what this moment served and leave with the taste of us still on my tongue. When I finally rose, my chair made a sound that seemed too loud for a room devoted to balance. I smoothed the napkin by instinct and left it on my plate like a small flag, white, yes, but not surrender. In the hallway outside the restrooms, a framed black and white photograph showed a city block that no longer existed, the past crisp in its incorrect certainty. I stared at the neat row of windows, at their symmetry, and felt the flare of gratitude that my life had outgrown grid lines drawn by someone else's hand. I walked out into noon light that made everything honest and let my phone warm in my palm until I could feel my pulse answering its quiet hum. I did not call my girlfriend then. I did not want my voice to carry the flavor of that room. I wanted to arrive at her with the taste of decision instead. On the subway back downtown, I watched reflections layer over other reflections, a field of faces moving in and out of one another with each stop, and thought about the first time I had stepped into her studio and known with the clarity of water that I had found a place where air could be a verb. I had not understood then that loving her would require more than tenderness, that it would ask me to declare myself in rooms that mistook control for care. The car shuddered, and I looked down at my open hands. They did not shake. The center of me felt like a door that had been latched for politeness and had finally discovered it could open both ways. When I reached street level, the city's noise pressed against me without penetrating. I walked the block to our cafe, the one with the slanting light and the table near the rear where we could see everyone without being seen, and the barista who remembered we liked the same pastry and cut it in half without asking. I stood in the doorway and let the scent of espresso lay itself along my nerves like a steadying palm. The table was empty, and at first I felt relief, then disappointment so quick it colored the air pink and tender. I took the seat facing the corridor where she would appear and placed my phone face down as if placing faith. I imagined her mother's voice like a lint I could brush from my sleeve, imagined it losing stick each time I pressed memory over intention. When she arrived, she found me with the tiny crease between her brows that only shows when she has been holding a thought too tightly. She slid into the chair opposite, and the space between us changed climate. She looked at my hands first, then my mouth, then my eyes, the way she does when she wants to read what decision has already been made. I let the quiet say the first thing, then I let my smile say the second. The third was the way my body leaned, imperceptible to anyone else, a degree of devotion I could feel in the soles of my feet. Under the table, our knees brushed and did not apologize. When we left, we walked the 2 blocks to her place with the ease of people who have already survived a storm they didn't invite, and I let my shoulder rest against hers exactly as long as the crosswalk light permitted and 1 step longer than that. At her door, I felt the urge to count breaths the way I do before stepping into a new space at work, but I refused myself the habit of bracing. Inside, the world returned to its correct scale. She pressed her mouth to my temple with a steadiness that unraveled the knot her mother had tried to tighten, and the gentle heat of that touch echoed along my skin like recognition. I let my hands move to her waist and felt the small inhale that always lives between her "you can" and her "yes." The kiss that followed was not fierce. It was accurate. It was the body saying, "I know where home is," even when the map is overwritten in someone else's ink. Later, when we lay on the couch with our feet propped on the armrest and our legs layered in the space where we both always ended up without planning, I felt the day sink through me like ink sinking into good paper. She drew shapes on the inside of my wrist with her thumb, and I answered by pressing my palm to the place on her back where worry anchors itself, holding until I felt it melt. I knew something had begun, and that its beginning would also be a series of endings I would have to allow. Love did not feel like a protest. It felt like alignment. It felt like the way light finds a window it trusts. That night I dreamed of rooms without corners, of doors that never locked, of hands choosing softness over proof. I woke with the soundless certainty that I would not be returning to the table where everything tilted, or if I did, I would bring a new gravity with me. I turned toward her and found her already watching the ceiling with that faraway focus she gets when measuring courage against consequence. I placed my palm lightly on her chest and felt her heart answer like it had been waiting for a signal. The day had not yet started, and already I knew it would be ours. I did not fall in love with her all at once. I slipped into it like a warm pool in a room that smelled faintly of oranges and turpentine. Like the studio she rented above the framing shop, where windows cut rectangles of brightness that moved across the floor all day and then slowly climbed the wall as if to watch her work. The first time I climbed those stairs, my knees announced my nerves with a vow I pretended not to hear. I was there to consult on a community project, her murals, my grant writing, our mutual friend's suggestion that we would mesh, a word I had never trusted until I saw how she arranged color like a person arranging apology, careful and complete. She was wearing a shirt that had once been white and now wore a galaxy of choices, and her hair looked like a promise she had made to the wind and kept. She stood from where she had been crouched over a canvas and wiped her hands on a rag that had already learned every pigment name by experience. The sunlight turned the tiny hairs on her forearms into a private field of gold. She handed me a sketch with a confidence that assumed I would understand, and I did, almost before I looked down, a pair of hands, not touching, but oriented toward each other with the kind of intention that makes space its own instrument. The margin notes read like a poem about proximity. I found myself wanting to speak in that room the way I never wanted to speak anywhere else, with less proof, more presence. I told her about the first building that made me cry, a library with windows that dipped low enough for a child to see out without climbing. I told her about the way my grandmother used to iron pillowcases, how the smell of starch is the smell of care in the language I was raised in. She listened with the attention of someone framing what they will later hang. She worked while we talked and somehow gave me more of her attention than people do when their hands are idle. When she laughed, which she did often and without asking permission, I felt it in my own ribs like something loosening a little. In the weeks that followed, the project became a geography of our hours. We learned the perimeter of each other's days, where the time wore thin, where it was richly upholstered. We met in the cafe, yes, but we also met in the aisles of the art supply store, our cards careful, our eyes greedy. We stood in front of walls with tape in our mouths and pencils behind our ears and talked with our eyebrows about placement like we had been doing it for a decade. She taught me that a hue can be a verb. I taught her that a line can be a sentence without needing a paragraph to justify it. We ate blueberries from the same container without remarking on how a thing becomes shared. And one afternoon, she reached across to adjust a ruler I was about to misread, and her fingers grazed the inside of my wrist, and I forgot how to occupy the room without announcing my need for breath. There was an age gap we pretended not to notice, not because it mattered, but because neither of us wanted the story to learn the wrong shape. She had a way of stepping into a room that said her body was welcome there. I had a way of stepping into rooms that apologized first and asked for permission later. Being near her made my posture change its mind. I started to catch myself mid-slope and lift. I bought a pair of boots I had wanted for years and wore them with the casual risk of someone practicing ownership. She noticed the change not by compliment, but by production, handing me a small square of canvas one evening with a smudge that somehow contained the exact color of my mouth when I had been laughing so hard I could not swallow water. I pinned it above my desk, and it made me braver at work than any workshop I had ever attended. We kissed for the first time in a moment that did not ask for trumpets. It was after a long day when the mural had begun to announce itself as a thing that would exist regardless of our doubt. We were cleaning brushes, the sink loud with the small storm of rinsing out, and she bumped my hip with hers in that way that means more light please, and I turned, and the room turned too. And the distance we had been honoring for weeks fell inward like a chapel kneeling toward evening. The kiss was gesture first, then pressure, then a hum that traveled from the roof of my mouth to the floor of my spine and returned as a note I had no instrument for. I placed my hands at her waist in the simplest map possible and felt her say yes with her breath alone. It lasted exactly as long as the water ran, and when it ended, there was no announcement, only two women rinsing ferrules and then hanging brushes to dry like tiny flags of a nation that had just drawn borders in gentle ink. I began to memorize the ways she liked to be touched not for performance, but for literacy. She preferred a palm to fingers at the small of her back, a sweep, not a tap on her shoulder when I moved behind her with a ladder, a hand at her nape when she read something out loud that made both of us stop and close our eyes for a second. She learned me quickly and without fear, the broad slide of her hand under my shirt skimming up my spine in slow increments until my breath hit that private snag that turns into a sound, and then staying there like a hand on the dimmer when light finally reaches rightness. The first time we reached the edge of ourselves and stepped through together, it was not because we had planned an arrival. It was because we had been walking the same path with intention, and the path ended at a door that did not require a key. The afterglow felt like a quilt spread across a floor we had been painting on for hours, improvised, earned, a place for all the paint we might still wear. We fell asleep that night with our legs knotted like sentences that refused tidy endings and woke with a softness in our muscles that read like relief. In the mirror over her sink, I saw a version of myself I had not been introduced to, cheeks flushed from circulation rather than embarrassment, hair unbothered by the burden of needing to be arranged for someone else's comfort, eyes steady on my own face. She came up behind me and rested her chin in the notch where my shoulder meets my neck and smiled without showing her teeth the way she does when she is trying to store a moment in a place she trusts. It would have been easy to pretend that the only story here was us learning one another. But families are architects and curators and sometimes auditors of what is allowed to exist in their houses. Hers believed in precision. Her mother believed in the kind of love that presented well on holidays and lived like a guest in every other month. I realized quickly that my laughter was too wide for rooms with rugs she cared about. I tried to tuck my edges in and scraped my knuckles against the furniture. And yet, there were surprises. Her mother loved the same films I did, but had never watched them without narrating the ways the costuming saved the story from itself. She hung photographs and arrangements that would have satisfied me at work, grids, spacing exact enough to suggest a ruler had been involved, frames like a choir. I found her occasionally compelling, in the way a careful cold can impress a person who grew up being told warmth was the only weather. I also watched her measure her daughter with a tape the rest of the world had retired. When she asked for accomplishments, she meant a very specific list, and all the other flowers were weeds to be tolerated in a controlled border, clipped before going to seed. The first time my girlfriend slid her hand beneath a table and placed it flat on my thigh while her mother recited a list of obligations like a recipe, I learned the liturgy of quiet resistance. We built our own liturgy with touches and looks and small reroutings. Still, there it was, a pressure system gathering in a room that pretended to be climate-controlled, the need not only to love her, but to choose her in front of the person who had chosen herself in a way that left no room for daughters who colored outside any line. The message came from a number that had never once texted me. It arrived as I was drafting an email and half listening to a colleague explain why a change in materials would only look minor and then ruin everything. I glanced at my screen expecting a delivery alert or a calendar reminder and found instead a short invitation written in a tone that requested my professionalism while assuming my compliance. The restaurant name was familiar. The time was noon. The request was to meet for context, which is a word I have only ever trusted when it comes from people who love the story more than the lesson. I could have ignored it. I could have forwarded it to the woman I loved and said, "This is yours to manage." But love, when it is of the durable sort, asks that we become hospitable to one another's adversaries without making our home for them. So I put on a jacket that made me feel like my bones were aligned correctly and went to a place where linen lies flat and servers move like proof that someone taught them manners before they learned money. There are offers that enter the room on white horses made of dollars. This one did not even bother with a saddle. It laid out funding for a residency my girlfriend had once dreamed about and tried to braid my absence into the terms like a ribbon no one would see when the end result hung on a wall. It suggested that my career was admirable and would keep me warm if I let it. It praised my organizational skill with the faintest undertone of "you will understand" cleaning up after other people's passions, and placed in front of me an itinerary that rewrote her appetite into a schedule with no space for a mouth that wasn't hers. For a moment, I felt flattered by the attention to detail, the way a person born into a house with lists can feel an unholy thrill when confronted with someone who has sharpened a pencil to a point and plans to use it. Then I felt something else, something older, a tendon memory from childhood when someone told me my hands were good hands for carrying other people's bags because they looked strong. The bag pressed into me now was lined with silk and carried the faint fragrance of a life that would photograph elegantly. It was also not mine. I realized the twist was not the money. It was the assumption that love is the first thing a woman will set down when a more attractive weight is offered. When I left that table, I was not angry. I was newly precise. I walked 2 blocks and bought a pastry we shared so often it felt like an inside joke, and I carried it across town as if it were a sacrament. In her studio, the light had arranged itself kindly across her work table, and she was standing with one hand on the back of her neck the way she does when the color refuses the silhouette. I set the pastry down on a clean square of paper and placed my palm at the base of her spine with a pressure she recognized. She leaned back, trusting, and I felt all the rooms we had ever been in together stack themselves like pages of a book you know by heart. I did not recount anything. I did not deliver the story as proof of my loyalty. I placed what had been offered to me beside what we had already chosen and let the scale correct itself. When she turned and pressed her mouth to mine, there was nothing triumphant in it. It tasted like relief and the faintest glaze of sugar. I slid my hand up under her shirt and found the place my palm always goes when I want to say patience, love, and felt her hips answer in that small tilt that means I hear you. When we moved together, it was slow and correct, the kind of rhythm that needs no metronome. When we came, it was not a flare. It was tide, strong enough to move the objects on a shore and leave the bigger shapes intact. After we lay there long enough to understand we were not about to be undone by someone else's need to orchestrate a life, I felt the first small fear. Not that we would lose each other to a checkbook, but that we would lose each other to the slow erosion of a third-person certainty that they knew better than our bodies about what our bodies had already decided. There are pressures you can ignore. There are pressures that need to be named out loud so they do not nest behind the heart and peck at it while you sleep. I began to speak to myself more clearly. I wrote notes to the part of me that still wanted to be applauded by rooms that prefer me contained. I rearranged my desk so that the things that moved me within reach were the first things my hands found when I reached without thinking. I wore her shirt to bed and washed it with care in the morning and folded it like a promise. I allowed myself to want what I wanted and to say so without trying to varnish it into acceptability. The varnish had always made it harder to breathe. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. It did not happen with a shout. It happened the way water finds hairline cracks in a vessel and the pressure writes a patient letter to the structure until the structure agrees to change shape. Invitations began arriving for events where I understood I would be observed. Not as myself, but as context. I stood beside her at openings and felt her mother's gaze like a level held to a wall, checking for plum. I counted the seconds between her mother's compliments and the polite pivot toward questions about what comes next that contained within them the answer she hoped we would recite. We rehearsed our gentlest choreography. Under tables, our knees brushed. In photographs, our shoulders touched. In hallways, we stood back to back like two people guarding a door everyone else pretended wasn't there. When we got home, we exhaled in a language that had no nouns, only verbs and the adjectives that live under the skin. She would lie on her stomach and I would slide my hands under her shirt to warm the place where pressure breeds and press until she sighed like the first honest breath after holding too long. She would turn and mat me with her mouth and make those slow, patient circles with her thumb against the inside of my wrist until my hips had no choice but to answer her name in motion. We learned to bring our bodies back to yes after rooms that insisted on maybe.
There were victories that looked small to anyone not keeping score. Her mother sent a link to a review and did not add commentary that translated to see how they noticed the parts one taught you. She asked after my work in a tone that approximated genuine interest, and I did not check the door for bolts as I answered. We stood in a kitchen after an event and filled small plates with fruit and cheese while everyone pretended they were not watching whether our fingers would meet over the same slice, and we let them learn that we did not require spectacle. It felt like a life. It also felt like waiting for a shoe that was no longer a shoe to drop. It felt like living under a ceiling painted sky blue with a hairline crack that the eye pretends is art. The escalation came in a quieter medium, email. A letter from a committee chair for a residency in another city, full of praise for her work, with a paragraph about concerns that read like a person had mistaken a lie for a map and was now using it to navigate my girlfriend's life. There were suggestions that her personal choices were complicating her candidacy. There were phrases like stability and focus and optics, polite nouns that in the mouths of people who sign stipends become instruments. I read the letter twice and then a third time and watched my chest grow tight the way a room goes hot when a vent is closed by a hand that isn't yours. I felt the old urge to put my head down and work harder, to become irrefutably good in all other categories so the part of me that is not desired by certain donors can be tolerated as the harmless eccentricity of a person whose output makes them valuable. I put my hands on the table and felt the wood against my palms. I counted the grain lines like an inventory of patience. And then I stood and walked to where she was and pressed my forehead to hers and let my eyes tell her what I would not drag her into with language yet. She nodded the way a person nods when she knows she is seen, not managed. That night we loved each other with a tenderness that felt like a revolution. Hands under shirts, yes, and that slow slide that finds the curve that makes the whole spine feel like a question mark made into a sentence. She unraveled my walls in centimeters, not centimeters as measurement, but as permission, her fingers learning each yes until all the yes joined hands and crossed the room. When I peeked, it felt like a truth I had carried since childhood, finally allowed to run outside without shoes. Her release came like a tide that understood shorelines as destinations, not obstacles. We found each other again after a small laugh between us that sounded like we had gotten away with something when really we had only remembered we do not owe our heat to anyone's comfort. Still, the cost presented itself in the morning. A family text thread went quiet after a cousin posted an article about the opening and used a phrase people use when they intend to be generous and instead reveal their inventory of acceptable. I placed my phone face down and poured coffee and stood in the patch of sunlight on the floor the way a cat would if she knew being animal was the most honest thing. She came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my middle and rested her cheek between my shoulder blades, and I felt that familiar settling that is not dependency but integration. If I am an instrument, she is the bow, and together we make a sound my family may never learn to love. But it is ours, and it is in tune.
The midpoint of the conflict arrived not with a confrontation, no slammed doors, no declarations, but with a withholding. A grant that had been all but certain vanished with a note about reallocated priorities. An invitation to a panel evaporated into a polite apology about limited slots. The pattern was too clean to be random. The pattern looked like a person who believed she was protecting her daughter from the inconvenience of being fully herself. Protection that feels like constriction is not protection. It is a slow theft disguised with good linens. I took a walk that day without any intention to arrive somewhere. I let my body set the pace and my thoughts spill and my hands stay empty. I realized I was angry not at the woman who has never learned to love anyone without editing them, but at the part of me that still feels the tug of wanting to be loved by editors. I promised myself I would stop mistaking publication for permission.
By the time I returned to the studio, the light had shifted and her hair caught it in a way that made me think of the first day again. I moved to her without ceremony and placed my mouth against the spot below her ear where she keeps her first yes of the day, and felt her lean back into me with a sound only I ever hear. We did not heal the world. We did something else. We declared a border and set both our feet on the same side of it. Just a quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button and stay with us here on Sapphic Tales.
The rupture, when it came, did not belong to us. It belonged to a plan conceived in a house with excellent lighting and poor ventilation for truths that sweat. Her mother organized a dinner that was not a dinner, but a tableau, the kind of evening where napkins learn the texture of tears because no one wants them to splash. The guest list was curated like a wall, donors and board members, and one critic who enjoys the smell of his own sentences. I understood as I entered that the room had been built to teach me a lesson about where I stand when a certain kind of money is present. What none of them calculated correctly was the power of touch in the shadow of their assumptions. At the table, beneath the cloth, she placed her foot over mine with the confidence of someone who refuses to be choreographed, and I slid my toes to meet hers, and we stayed like that through a course and a speech and a toast that tried to turn the evening into a parade for a victory no one present had. actually earned. When the plates were cleared, she excused herself in the only way she knows how, with grace, and I followed her into the cool of a side hallway where the air moved like a person and not like a sentiment. We faced each other with a quiet that felt as loud as applause. I lifted my hand and threaded my fingers into the hair at the base of her skull and felt her exhale against my mouth before we kissed, the tiniest softening that she always does, the surrender that isn't surrender but invitation. The kiss tasted like pear and resolve. It tasted like a room full of watchers and the choice not to perform. When it deepened, it was our own breath we were answering, not the noise behind a door. I felt the curve of her spine under my palm and pressed exactly where she had taught me, and her knees softened in that way I could feel through both our shoes. We parted with the kind of smile that isn't triumph but recognition. We had taken exactly what the evening tried to steal, and we had taken it without asking. Back in the main room, the temperature changed. The critic shifted slightly toward us with the alertness of a person who believes he has just found a column. Her mother's eyes narrowed by a fraction, a surgeon's precision applied to the location of a wound she could not name without making it real. The donors clinked their glasses and pretended not to see. It was almost funny how much labor it requires to call love a rumor when love is standing in the room holding a napkin. The crisis reached me by email 2 days later. A letter from an attorney on behalf of a foundation that had previously been generous in a way that felt like partnership. The letter used words like morals clause and reputation risk, and it framed its threats with the politest phrases about future possibilities. There is a tone only certain people deploy when they believe their money should teach you manners. It sounds like a lullaby written in a key your body rejects. I read the letter once. I closed my eyes. I placed my hand against my chest and felt the beat that has never been out of time. I printed the letter and set it under a ceramic cup so the paper would remember weight. Then I walked to her and laid my cheek against the place where her shoulder becomes her neck and said nothing with my mouth. My hands spoke. They slid beneath her shirt and asked the question they always ask, and her body answered the way it always answers when I have brought the truth and not the fear. We moved the way water moves downhill, guided by gravity and the memory of other descents. When we reached the place where both of us go light behind the eyes, she exhaled my name without language, and I felt something lift off me that I had carried since childhood. After, we lay like a field after harvest, plenty left to gather, but the shape of the work now visible. She traced lazy ovals on my ribs, and I watched the ceiling learn our breath. I made a decision there that did not require a speech. I called an ally who knows how to translate love into paperwork, and I learned how to say no in the language of contracts. I told my job I would be busy for a week, and then I spent that week rearranging rooms not with furniture, but with boundaries. When the formal break arrived, when her mother called with a silence that pretended to be stunned but wore familiar shoes, I felt sadness, yes, but not the kind that begs for reversal. This sadness was a river that had finally found its course. I let it run. I let it wash out the silt from under old logs of approval I had thought were bridges. I held her through her own grief, which came in waves of rage and tenderness, and then quiet that lasted a whole afternoon and made the light look like it had opinions. I fed her small sweet things and stroked her hair and allowed myself to cry exactly where she could see me, because we had promised someone always gets to cry where the other can see. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. Don't forget, every week we share new tales. Subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you're always the first to hear them. We built new habits in the wake of subtraction. Morning tea in mugs we did not have to hide when certain visitors arrived. Walks without looking over our shoulders for a car that meant inspection. Work that did not apologize for being ours. Kisses in grocery store aisles where the peaches live, soft and unpoliced, quick and entirely sufficient. Nights that ended with her head on my chest and my palm resting low on her abdomen in a claim that made no one else purr. The last attempt came at an event for a different artist. We stood across the room from a woman who had learned to smile with her eyes while her mouth delivered harm, and I realized I no longer needed armor for such encounters. She approached with a blandness that suggested she believed she still held a key to a door we had bricked up and painted over. She spoke with a tone I refused to transcribe in my body. I stepped closer to the woman I love. I placed my hand flat on the small of her back. She turned her face toward me just enough that I could see the corner of her mouth lift. The conversation ended before it could begin. The room learned something I had learned months ago. A mother can try to break her daughter's love by calling it impractical, by starving it of public air, by offering prizes with strings. But love that has learned its own name in the dark cannot be unlearned in a bright room. The world did not end. It reorganized. The invitations changed shape. The money returned from different sources, more modest sometimes, more willing often, the kind that arrives with gratitude instead of instructions. Her work grew bolder, not because rebellion is a virtue, but because truth is a muscle. Mine did too. I found myself designing spaces that understood softness as structure, rooms with corners that did not punish and windows that did not assume the outside was a threat. I put benches where people could sit next to each other and pretend they were not about to change each other's lives. We moved into an apartment with light that does not apologize. The first night we slept there, we laid the mattress on the floor because the bed hadn't arrived, and we made a nest out of blankets and breath. Our first morning, I brushed crumbs from her shoulder after breakfast in bed and pressed my mouth where skin meets bone, and she made the exact sound that tells me she feels like home even when the walls are new. We hung nothing for a week, and then hung everything in one afternoon while a pot of something with tomatoes simmered, and the whole place smelled like the kind of hunger that is easy to solve. Months passed, and the seasons took their turns. Letters came, some with apologies dressed as epiphanies. Some were real. We answered the real ones. We placed the others in a drawer that we don't open unless one of us needs to remember where not to return. Her mother's name still lives on my phone in a folder I rarely click. When I do, it is to honor a woman who loved her daughter the way she was taught, and to bless the distance that allowed us to learn a different way. We practice our intimacy like musicians practice scales, not to perform at someone else's concert, but to keep the fingers honest. Hands under shirts, the reverent slide that makes my spine remember a language it learned in the dark with her. The guided strokes that say right there, the synchronized peaks that arrive like tides loyal to a moon no one else can schedule. Afterglow like a room we air out gently, limbs entwined, hearts settling into a shared meter. We whisper the affirmations lovers write on each other's bones. Feels safe, feels seen, feels like the place the maps forgot to name. When fear wakes at 3 a.m., we do not negotiate with it alone. We turn and face it with foreheads touching and breath moving in the slowest possible loop until terror remembers it is only a guest, not a landlord. Sometimes, on Sundays, We walk through neighborhoods where houses wear their histories in paint and porch railings. We hold hands not as protest and not as spectacle, but as a way of balancing our bodies while we talk with them about trust. Children point because softness is interesting, and their parents sometimes smile because envy is a teacher if you invite it. We buy bread we do not need and leave crumbs for birds that never say thank you, and that is fine because gratitude is not a currency I want to keep in coins. On the anniversary of the lunch where a woman tried to make me trade my life for an itinerary, we returned to that restaurant and ordered dessert first. We sat at a different table under a different lamp and laughed with our mouths open, like people who know they do not owe quiet to anyone's idea of tasteful. I placed my hand palm up on the table and felt her fingers arrive without preface. The server poured water and did not look away. A couple in the corner paused their conversation to let my happiness not bother them. The room held us without correction. It felt extravagant. It felt like how ordinary should feel when no one is busy trimming it to fit. I do not hate her mother. I resist her strategies. I bless the part of her that believed love and control were one garment, and I ask her lineage to learn to separate them for the sake of all the daughters who will come through their houses wearing edges. If we ever share a room again, I will place a napkin on my lap and keep my shoulders relaxed and speak about her daughter's art in the present tense with my whole face. If I could speak to the woman I was before any of this, I would not tell her to brace. I would tell her to stand where the light is, to keep her hands open, to consider her heart as a house she is allowed to decorate in colors that looked garish to the people who raised her. I would tell her that love does not win because it is louder. It wins because it is patient enough to stay in the room long after the argument has gotten bored of itself. We fall asleep now with the window cracked and the city making it small, civilized noises below. She curls behind me and drapes her thigh over my hip, and my body exhale writes the word kept along my ribs. In the morning, she finds my hand under the sheet and does not need to ask if I am awake. She reads my palm like a book that has only ever loved one reader. We rise and we work and we make a noon meal of ripe things, and we go back to our desks and we kiss the way people do when they understand that time is not a ruler but a room. Sometimes I still feel the old ache at the base of my throat when a family invitation arrives with a caveat or does not arrive at all. I place my hand there and press gently and think of the first moment she placed my hand in the center of her back and taught my palm the difference between wanting and knowing. I have learned to put my sadness in a chair and feed it something simple and ask it what it needs. It rarely asks for permission to leave. It asks to be witnessed, and then it goes find new work. If it kept you hooked, subscribe now to Sapphic Tales so you never miss the next. I chose the light that touches her face. I chose the house we build with hands and breath and the smallest yes no one else notices. I chose the version of myself that laughs in rooms that used to require my silence. I chose the woman whose mother tried to break us and taught us, instead, how to hold without apologizing for our grip. And now the days turn like pages in a book neither of us is afraid to finish because we learned the point was never to reach the end. It was to keep reading each other out loud until the sound itself becomes home.